Well, hello, Kalspera, and thank you to everyone for attending this very long event.
Yeah. We're on. Yeah, cool. Well, hello, Kalspera, and thank you to everyone for attending this very long event. Yeah. We're on.
I think Angela stopped the.
Well, hello.
Are you Rebecca? I don't know who it's coming from. Okay. It's difficult to hear myself with a delay.
It's all right now.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, let's all keep our mics muted.
Yeah, that'd be good. So yeah, thank you to all of you for watching so far. And thank you to all of you, all of the speakers we have with us today that gave these brilliant presentations. And this topic is, of course, very difficult, complex, urgent. So I hope with the Q&A we can, I guess, open up some bits of it a bit further. I am Danai, and I'm 1/3 of System of Systems, along with Rebecca, who is right next to me. I don't know. That person, and Maria, who is off the screen, just making sure everything is running smoothly. And we're joined by 5 speakers: Nandita, Angela, Rahmane, Apostolis, and al-Kashef. And today I'll be moderating the conversation, but Rebecca will take the role of taking the questions that you leave on the live chat and relaying them to us. So if you do have any questions, please do write them in the live chat and we'll get to them. This time the conversation will be held in English, and unfortunately we don't have any Greek interpretation, mainly due to time constraints, but we will make sure that we can answer also the Greek questions if you do write them. I think we'll try to favor the audience questions throughout the Q&A, but maybe I can start with a question for Angela, just to continue the flow of the event so far. So Angela, we really wanted to include your film in the program because we felt that your approach to filmmaking has a very interesting way of considering the notion of externalization in very broad terms, and the way you cross and connect geographies and times and events through film. And of course, your work is like 1 hour and 45 minutes, and we've only shown very few excerpts. So it's hard to show the depth of the connections that you've created within that work. So I thought that maybe you can tell us a bit about how these different subjects and places and times come together in this work. What is the overarching connections between the scenes in the port of Piraeus, the refugee camps in Moria, the European Parliament, the ancient ruins in Corinthos, etc. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. And thanks for your presentations. I really enjoyed to listen to these analysis, this very hard analysis, I would say, or very precise analysis. I think that it is very difficult to say how things, are leading to each other while one is actually seeing what's happening in terms of migration for a very, very long time, in terms of this border, in terms also of the situation of Greece within Europe, in terms of the so-called colonial matrix, which in Germany can be very well seen even after the politics of the German Reich, the Baghdad ban, the private-public partnerships, the type of matrices that have led to a system that is Europe, and that is kind of dealing with this double movement. On the one hand, the economical one that goes outside of Europe, and the other way to the flux of migration that comes back, as I told in an earlier work of mine, in the opposite direction of capital investment in a certain sense. So migration flow and money flow somehow connects in a certain way. And this is a older history. So I was interested for a long time in this itineraries and this kind of geographies in between nation states, which are trade routes, migration routes, travel routes, and so on and so on. So this type of interlinking, I think, is a method that comes from a certain type of trying to see this itineraries in a certain sense. And itineraries are also something that are, for me, deeply rooted in the way that we are actually making our subjectivities. And I would go so far and so extreme as to say that, and I think I'm join some of the things that were said earlier today, that the freedom of movement is also the freedom of a certain type of thinking in a certain way. I would say that the idea of freedom of movement and the freedom of thought are kind of connected, and they are connected also quite deeply in if you study some kind of like let's say a reformed psychiatric studies such as the institutional psychotherapy ideas of Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze and so on. So the kind of freedom of movement and freedom of thought and something that is our making and subjectivities are connected. So we can kind of, on the other hand, say that stopping the movements or stopping the freedom of movement will also lead to a form of stigma, not only racism and stigmatization, but a fixity of thinking that in the end is also quite pathological in a way. So I have tried to kind of compose a narrative here that tries to go back also in history. So we are having, of course, the happenings in Lesbos, where I was for a few years, but also connected to the kind of other situation, for example, in Skouries, where you have the most heavy type of intervention of capital in the nature of the forest, which is really destabilizing a whole area in Greece and destabilizing the whole northern Greek kind of economical income in terms of agriculture and so on and so on. So how are these related? Of course, you have two things. The one is like the future of the becoming of people, for example, in Skouries, who might go to migrate again or migrate once anew for the first time. And then at the same time, in this period, you have people who just have had the experience of a very real war and who were kind of migrating in. And then you have this destabilization of the financial systems, which again also moves into some sort of a migration of a lot of people from Greece then to Western European countries in terms of jobs and so on. So this kind of overlayering is not only overlayering of tensions, and it's not just psychological, it is of course completely real, but it is also perhaps, and this is what I liked today to see or to hear tonight, it is governmental, meaning it is on the level of laws also. So, and this is an overlayered situation of law, that the external border monitoring is becoming a kind of legislative becoming that is overlayering other law systems. I mean, this is what was, in my understanding, very well explained today.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is very interesting how you've managed to bring all these different layers together in the film. I wonder, I saw that we had quite a few questions, so I just want to make sure that we can go through them.
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions. And I think I'm going to choose them according to what flows from the last one, because we have a question that I think links to what Angela was saying about freedom of movement. So this would be for Nandita. Regarding the idea of planetary politics from your talk, is freedom of movement inherently decolonial? Could rejection of the nation be co-opted, for example, by neoliberal regimes looking for cheap labor? And the second part to this question, what would a decolonizing world look like with regards to migration, and what can activists and scholars do to ensure that our non-nationalist political imaginaries take aim at capitalism and colonialism? Did you get all of that?
Yes, I should have been writing that down. That's a very interesting and complex question, and I'll try and answer that. Let me just start by saying that limitations to freedom of movement defines oppression, right? It is the basis upon which exploitation of people's labor, of their lives takes place. It's the basis upon which, practices of expropriation or extraction, like the minings that Angela was talking about, it's the basis, like limiting people's ability to be freely mobile, meaning that both in terms of being able to escape oppressive, exploitative relationships, as well as, go to places where survival is more likely, right? In both ways, denying people their freedom of movement is the basis of all of these systems that we, of course, must oppose, whether it's capitalism today, any sort of class relationships, as well as the state, right? The state is the body that is interested in limiting people's mobility precisely to further, ruling class relationships in whatever territories they control. So I do very profoundly believe that freedom of movement is very much tied to freedom, period. Without freedom of movement, there really is no ability to be free from class relationships or from state rule. I think, of course, we haven't always lived in a world of nation states. It's actually a relatively recent development. So, of course, changes in the form of the state, we've in some of our lifetimes, we have moved from a change of being governed by imperial states to being governed by nation states. There's nothing preventing the state form from further changing, right? Particularly in response to social struggles, right? The imperial state disappeared in part because of social struggles, and we got the nation state, right? So, which I think was a big mistake. To tie liberty or freedom to nationalism, I think was a profound, profound mistake that we are all living the consequences of right now. So yes, certainly states can co-opt social struggles, they can co-opt our demands for freedom and reuse them to contain us further. So we always have to be vigilant, but at the same time, to argue that we could somehow decolonize our social relationships to one another, at a planetary level, to reorganize our relationship to our labor, reorganize our relationship to the rest of the life on this planet, human and non-human, without demanding freedom of movement is really difficult for me to understand.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great response.
Thank you. My computer is freezing a bit, but I hope it works enough to hear all of you. Yeah, I was also wondering how, Rahman, you can respond to that question as well, because you've also, I think, in somewhat of your work that I've read, speak about nation states as something that wasn't always there, and that has, and the restriction of freedom of movement is very much affecting the way we perceive the world and the way we understand who can be where. So I was wondering if you can respond to that as well.
Actually, I was interested by the distinction that Nandita made between the nation state and imperial state, because I'm not actually sure that they are distinguishable. At least I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You can be a nation state and an imperial state. Actually, if you look at colonial states, they were nation states. Those states that created those colonial empires were also nation states. And I have the impression that even today, this dynamic of the imperial state continues. If you look at, what European Union, the work that I did on migration is really kind of the kind of power that European Union is projecting in West Africa in an effort to try to control movement of people there. That's the work of an imperial state. And so I think we're still into that world. And then we have nation states as well. One thing that strikes me about this question about the decolonizing movement, I think freedom of movement is indeed, freedom and non-freedom of movement is indeed extremely colonial so far. Because when I'm an African working in the Netherlands, and I'm called as the word that people apply to me is not migrant but expatriate. So expatriate are really people who have this freedom of movement, whereas immigrants are people who take the freedom of movement or against the imperial structures. So what I mean by here is that there are certain kind of movements that are favored by these imperial state structures in which we live. You have people who can have high-paying job contracts in many places across the world. So their movement is favored. And then you have people who are just left in horrible situations, and when they try to escape, the structure, this imperial structure, try to contain them. And if you look at how this structure looks like, it really kind of reflects the legacy of the old colonial situation that we had in the 19th century, because overwhelmingly it's really people in the West or in the global North who have this freedom of movement and whose freedom of movement is actually rewarded and encouraged, at least in the elite layers of those societies, whereas people in the South do not have that. So this is deeply, deeply colonial, and it is colonial because these nation states in the West are still today imperial states.
Yeah, I was thinking also how what you're saying might relate to what you've alluded to in your talk about the root causes of migration and how that is used by the EU to have control over Western African nations. And I was wondering if you could expand on your critique of the root causes of migrations.
Well, the way I understand it is that this discourse about the root causes of migration is really something that is coming out of the EU. In Africa, people are not interested in this, question of what the root causes of migration are, precisely because they don't see migration as a problem that then needs to be studied in order to find its root causes. Because when you speak of root causes, it's because you already pathologized the behavior. You already think that migration is a bad thing. Therefore, you have to understand why it is happening, despite the fact that it is a bad thing. And so the EU is trying to force that discourse in West Africa. As you know, I don't think it is really working because it goes against the grain of what people in that region understand. And that probably explains partly the kind of failure of the EU to project its power, to create those policies of externalization in the region. So to me, it's just a bogus discourse. I'm not even sure I'm not even sure to what extent they believe in it. But one thing that strikes me is that something can be made to be believable and become like almost true through the force of money, because there is so much research that is being funded on the root causes of migration that you have so many people, very smart people who are talking about it, experts and whatnot, that it is becoming something like a truth. So it's almost like the reverse of what we hear about fake news. So this is not like fake news. It's kind of truth that is built on something that is fake. I don't know how to express that, but that would be I think my biggest critique of that. It's the creation of this reality, and then we were just talking about it and forgetting that it's just something that we want to believe.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like an engineering of this reality so that power can be.
There is always an Orwellian aspect to those things. So, and that's what I'm seeing here.
Do we have any more questions, Rebecca? Or do we have
we have loads.
Okay.
There's actually a question which you've pretty much answered, Rahmane. Someone asked, instead of seeing migration as a problem to be managed by the EU and tackled it at its roots, you mentioned positive approaches to migration by African policymakers. Could you elaborate on this? Would you like to add to that, or the kind of positive approaches?
I think, in fact, the attitude of African policymakers is that migration is just something that is happening. It's like a phenomenon, and any phenomenon in reality has bad aspects and good aspects. And their idea is just that you should try to improve, to work on what is good in it, and basically get rid of what is bad. So the kind of dialogue that they try to have with the European Union was, to work in that direction. That, of course, we understand that migration can have problems. Any phenomenon, that social phenomenon, has, its downsides and upsides. But let's work together on the upsides. But to do that, you need to have a kind of genuine interlocutor on the other side. And the European Union was not that kind of interlocutor, because they are in this kind of power relation with the Africans. Because they feel that they are so much more powerful than the Africans, they just believe that they could impose the solutions, which they preferred, without having this conversation. So the positive approach would be that, having a genuine conversation, and looking at migration as a fact of life that can have positive aspects as well as negative and positive, depending on your position. It's perhaps something that is positive that can be seen as being positive by the Africans, the European can see it as being negative, but then you have to talk in order to reach a kind of common ground about it. So that's the kind of discourse that they had. And actually, they try to push that through this Rabat process that they had in the early 2000s. There is this political dialogue between the EU and the Economic Community of West African States, and other, actually African Union as well, that is called the Rabat process. I don't know if you heard of that. So, but that didn't work, because I think the Europeans didn't really believe in it. So,
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of what Apostolis was commenting on in his presentation, referring to the new pact on migration and asylum this September, and how, in their own words, they're setting out for a fairer and more European approach to this process. And I was wondering how, if Apostolis, you could comment on what are some of the methods that the EU continues to use to offset their responsibilities.
Yes, although the pact itself is not an instrument that is attempting directly externalization, is mostly a negotiation that will happen in order to produce a new arrangement between extremely conflicting positions within the Union. There is something I thought while listening to the presentations, which I omitted doing, and perhaps it's worth trying to explain. When it comes to the degree of colonialism contained within an attempt for externalization, you do see a varying degree of this element in different areas. And I was thinking about this while listening to Rahman before. The last 3 years, there's been a process of negotiating and signing status agreements with Western Balkan countries and Frontex to allow its border guards to operate in these countries. And one basic, very fundamental element the Union pushed for, the European Commission, who negotiated the agreements on behalf of Frontex, was that the operations that will be deployed will have immunity equal to the immunity that a UN mission has in the same region or in Africa, or a NATO mission has when they deploy in a post-conflict peacekeeping situation. And it was very obvious that it is worth exploring whether these patterns of externalization do contain mentalities and approaches that carry a historical perspective, you know, a remembrance of how we dealt with specific people and specific regions, but translated into a narrative that has to do with migration control and now outsourcing border control functions. So I don't have the answer. It's more or less thinking over what Rahman was saying before and just observing the same dynamic taking place in this negotiation that happens between the Western Balkan countries, the EU, on how border control will be pursued in their territory by European forces. And it's interesting to see how important in this process is the budget lines, the financial capacities that are being dedicated, and what the historical relations of its particular place with the imperial apparatus of the West have been, and how this influences the modern process right now, with a differing narrative, more or less. It's a bit academic and complicated, but it has very practical implications, actually, on how operations are being deployed on the field, what kind of rights and privileges officers get when they deploy, etc., etc. So it's not only theoretical, it's also practical.
Do you also see like a big difference between the way these policies are employed in the Western Balkans and in countries in like the global South? Are there any practical ones that you could mention?
There's a practical difference between how direct the importance of financial capacities is when it comes to negotiating similar agreements with African countries, and how less explicit this becomes when you have a political negotiation between Western Balkan countries and the European Commission in the last 2 years. So the financial element is not absent, but is much less spoken in the second case. Whatever this might mean for anybody that examines these processes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think Rebecca has some more questions.
We have too many to get through, but I think maybe it'd be good to bring Kashef in now. This one's quite specific for you. So the question is Germany's main interest in the outsourcing of EU borders to sell weapons and increase their military presence? Is it also because of their racist and nationalistic approach towards the third world in big inverted commas?
So let's say that Germany leads in the EU and it wants to approve this leadership through different tactics and international relations. This number one. Second thing, for sure, there is interest of selling weapons. Germany is one of the biggest country around the world in the weapon industry. And the military presence that we see in Mali. But I will say that Germany has an interest on expanding the military presence in the African continent more than the business interest in the African continent. They have a big business interest in African countries, and it's obvious also through not just the development project, but through the different business project and how Germany bring different African countries and African leaders to negotiate and do agreements and do business deals after every G20. There is the German Initiative for Business in Africa. And when we are talking about racism and the nationalistic approach or like the German racism, actually, I would say like you European yourself, you feel the racism from German. Like there's a structural problem when it comes to talk about racism, but there is a big difference for me between racism towards third world and the interest, the economical interest and the power and the influence from such a European country like Germany in Africa. And I would say like even when there was a social in one of these African countries or many other different African countries outside EU, and it was kind of affecting different aspects of the relation between such countries, let's say the North African countries after the 2011 uprising, and how EU put too much efforts and resources just to control such a movement and to not just to control it, but somehow to stop it.
Yeah, thank you for your response.
Should I take another couple more questions and then?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're kind of close, so maybe we just need to get through.
Okay, so maybe a question going back to Nandita. What role do you think deportation plays in the construction of the nation state and the conception of national belonging and national identity?
Yeah, it's a profound aspect of creating national identities, is creating the identity of the migrant, right? The migrant and the citizen are the two, is a core binary of the contemporary system that we live in. So having some people who are deportable and others who are not deportable, although that's starting to shift as well, right? We have, for instance, in the UK, the ability for the state to deport even its citizens. But currently we live in a world where citizens are not deportable and migrants are deportable. And so that creates a world in which inside each and every nation states are a group of people. You know, it's a form of apartheid. There's a group of people who are governed through a different legal regime, right? The citizens are governed under a legal regime that allows them to remain in the country regardless of whatever they have done, and another legal regime for migrants that makes them deportable, and that carries throughout the rest of each and every national society. If you're deportable, you're also vulnerable to pressure from employers. If you're deportable, you're also vulnerable to pressure from landlords. If you're deportable, you're also, obviously much more vulnerable to the pressures of the state. So that's the system that we live in. And I think that, just going back to the earlier point, like, I don't think this is a semantic issue of whether we live in a world of imperialism or we live in a world of nationalism. I don't think that's a semantic issue. I think it's a profound difference that we need to pay attention to. We live in a world of nation states, and while it might feel like imperialism, right, because many of the same power dynamics, many of the same practices are in place, right? Land is still being expropriated around the world. People's labor is still being exploited, and people are still being denigrated. But that it's important to recognize, for instance, that the way that the EU uses its financial clout to force other nation states to enact policies that the EU believes is in its benefit is not imperialism. Right? This is actually nation state to nation state, quote unquote, negotiation. And if we ignore that and we just say, oh, this is imperialism, then what we're ignoring is actually the kind of fundamental basis of power within nation states. Because one of the things that nation states do, whether they're in the EU or they're in Africa or Asia or Latin America, is it allows the people who live in those nation states, those citizens who are not deportable, to believe that the state operates on their behalf, instead of the fact that each and every nation state operates in a global system that's obviously incredibly hierarchical. Some nation states have much more power than others. Some nation states form into bodies like the EU and other bodies around the world. But if we're not able to see how important nationalism is, how important immigration controls are, how important the idea of that we all somehow belong to a particular society and not other, and we're out of place when we're in other, societies that are quote unquote not our own, then I think we're really profoundly missing a key characteristic of power in today's world. And so I think that the paying attention to the figure of the migrant allows us to analyze the world that we live in better, because we didn't have the figure of the migrant during imperialism, right? Imperial states were not interested in immigration controls for the most part. They were interested in emigration controls. They didn't want people to leave their territories. It's when we shifted into a post-colonial world of nation states that states became more interested in immigration controls, preventing people from entering their territory. And that changes everything. That changes the way capitalism operates. That changes the way that our subjectivities are aligned to power, right? And so I do think it's important to pay attention to deportability, right? It is the profound legal difference that shapes our lives today. It's the profound binary between citizen and migrant that we need to pay attention to.
Thank you so much.
Could I ask a question? Sorry, I was curious about how Nandita, how you would respond then to Rahmane's where would you locate the expat within that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the expat is a nicer label to be called than a migrant, right? But it doesn't mean, I mean, you know, depending on what rights you have, right? If some expats are actually citizens of the places that they live in, but they're still called expats, which I think is a feature of racism, right? It's this idea that you're not really you know, you may be legally a citizen, but you're not really a member of the nation, so we'll still call you an expat. Other expats could not be citizens, so it really depends. But at the end of the day, whether you're a citizen in the place that you live or not makes a world of difference, right? It puts you into a different legal regime than the regime that non-citizens are placed in, whatever they're called, right? And whatever their status. So I do think that that matters. But of course, you know, I think the term expat aligns with class, right? There's a certain class of people who move around the world that are not called migrants, which I think points to the fact that who we think of as migrants are actually the global poor.
Yeah, I feel like also in your book, you just make a very good critique of how migration, nation state, and capital come together. And I think that's quite key actually to thinking about this, especially when you think that like even just the border market is billions and billions of dollars. Maybe we can, I think we're pretty much close to the time. So maybe Rebecca can give us a last question.
Can I have a question?
Yeah. Sure, go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to throw in again an argument, which is that it's bound to what enables us to resist and enables us also to resist a kind of identification, such as national identification, for example, or simple monolithic type of identifications. And perhaps what has been also very strongly said in terms of when we look at resistances and how migration is actually, it is going over borders, it's transgressing borders. And you can see that since a long time, there is this kind of fiction that was also spoken upon about borders that keep, things apart, and in reality, much less views and gaze is done about all these possibilities that people have in order to transgress these borders and also transgress these situations and hard segmentations, as it's called. So I wanted just to throw in this, for me, very important perspective, which is related to when I speak, I'm talking about migration, not only from, a first generation, you have also to think about the second generation, the third generation of migration, a different kind of constitution of citizenship, if you want to say so, different degrees and layers and of identification and citizenship, which I think are very key when we talk about politics and resistances to these regimes in a certain sense. So I'm kind of like asking myself if we do ourselves a favor if we have this kind of strong polarization, as we just heard about in terms of citizen and non-citizen. And we had this discussion a very long time ago in Germany within research projects on migration, where we also looked on the historical conditions of migration from World War II to post-World War II in terms of Gastarbeiter migrations, and then the new kind of European migrations after '93, after Maastricht, and later on in 2003 to 2010, when there was new strategies and governing strategies applied. And I think it is very important to see that somehow interlinked with each other historically, but also in a certain sense, to understand that this kind of, let's say, awful politics of today, this shock and war politics of European migration control, is very much based also on some sort of an image, on a kind of a belief system, on a fiction, on a form of identification, but all of that can be very well deconstructed also. So I think it is important for thinking resistance to understand that territories are, made out of flags. Flags are signs of expression. Signs of expression can be taken away, and the expression can change, and thus territories can change, to make it, a little bit utopic in that sense. But it is not, it is not. If you think about this type of how to resist and how migration pass borders, it is very much about checking this whole system of flaggings, of territorializations, territories, and so on. So in my understanding, it is very important to see the migration as a kind of not only a layer that will change history, national histories profoundly. It will have a very different way to look at history, I think, soon. Will not have the same categories to historize what has happened or what is happening, but also to kind of understand the forces of expression that are enacting in these conditions. And I don't want to sound, like a little bit too utopic or something like that, but perhaps because the different experiences from generations of migrations, specifically in relation to Germany, for example, and their politics. And I said before, you can also find EU politics already in the German Reich type of exterior politics. Think of how they engaged with the Ottoman Empire, the Baghdad Ban, the Shanghai Ban, all this type of economical projects that have already engaged in, forced work programs in, for Armenian populations, and so on and so on and so on. So there is a whole history that has a, interlinked kind of,
Yeah, I think it's a good note to end on how to resist that binary and how we can think of it differently. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Rebecca, to the conversation from the questions, or should we just end it here?
I mean, yeah, I guess apologies to the people we haven't been able to. Yeah, it would be great to hear more from all of you. We have a few more questions, but I think we'll have to keep them for another time. Yeah, Kashef, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to just to say something in the end. It's not a European crisis. It's not an European issue. Actually, migration is not a crisis. It's not a phenomenon. It's a nature. It's a human nature being. And we have to find solution and ways of organizing it, not to prevent it, because it will never stop. That's it. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. We totally agree to that. So I guess we'll have to end now. Thank you all so much for bringing in your thoughts. It's been really, really great to hear your different perspectives. And we do cherish that you all have slightly different points you're coming at it from. Yeah, and thank you to everyone that posed all those questions. And we're really sorry we didn't get through all of them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this.
Should we start the live stream?
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Okay.